Locked out of her husband's funeral. Then the final clause changed everything. You're not on the list. That was the first sentence I heard the morning of my husband's funeral. Not, I'm sorry for your loss. Not, are you all right? Just that. You're not on the list. The young man at the entrance of the funeral home wouldn't meet my eyes when he said it. He was barely 30. Black suit. Polished shoes. A clipboard held too tightly in his hand. Snow drifted down in slow, quiet sheets over the parking lot in Montpelier, Vermont. The sky was the color of old tin. The kind of winter morning Richard used to call honest. I stood on the stone steps, my gloved hands folded in front of me. I'm Eleanor Whitman, I said. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. I'm his wife. He swallowed. I'm sorry, ma'am. I was told this is a private family service. Private family. The words didn't hit all at once. They settled. Like snow. Behind the young man, through the glass doors, I could see the foyer. White lilies. A framed photograph of Richard in his navy blazer, smiling at something outside the frame. Probably me. He always smiled softer when he looked at me. People were already inside. Daniel. Claire. Their spouses. A few neighbors. Family. I had been married to Richard Whitman for 28 years. 28 winters in Vermont. 28 summers by Lake Champlain. 6 years sitting beside a hospital bed, while machines kept time better than any clock. But that morning I was not on the list. I looked past the young man and saw Daniel near the coat rack. He saw me too. For a moment our eyes met through the glass. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look confused. He looked resolved. The door opened slightly behind the attendant. Cold air slipped inside. Daniel stepped forward but stayed just inside the threshold. This was Dad's wish, he said evenly. Immediate family only. Immediate. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Just a quiet rearranging of understanding. I am his immediate family, I replied. Daniel's jaw shifted. Legally, yes. But this is about blood. There it was. Blood. The word people use when they want to make someone else disappear. Claire appeared behind him, her black coat tailored perfectly, her hair pinned neatly despite the weather. We don't want any tension today, she said softly. Let's keep this simple. Simple. Richard had never liked that word when it came to people. I looked down at my gloves. The left thumb had a loose thread. I had meant to trim it. I sat beside your father every day for 6 years, I said, not raising my voice. I held his hand when he couldn't lift it. I fed him when he forgot how to swallow. I slept in that hospital chair when you both flew home early because you had meetings. Neither of them answered. Snow gathered along the edge of the steps. A car door shut somewhere in the lot. Daniel's voice hardened slightly. This isn't the place for that. No, it wasn't. The place for that had been every day of the last 6 years. I looked once more at Richard's photograph through the glass. Then I stepped back. I see, I said. The young attendant closed the door gently. Not slammed. Not forceful. Just closed. The sound of the latch was soft, but final. Richard and I met when I was 44. He had already built his construction business by then. Whitman Contracting. Modest. Steady. The kind of company that repaired roofs after storms and rebuilt barns when they leaned too far into winter. He was a widower when we met. Claire was 19. Daniel 22. Old enough to form opinions. Young enough to hold grudges. I never tried to replace their mother. I never touched her photographs. I learned the dates that mattered. Birthdays. College graduations. The anniversary of her passing. I stood quietly in the background of every family photo unless someone pulled me forward. Richard used to squeeze my hand under the table when things grew tense. They'll come around, he would whisper. I believed him. When his heart first failed, it was a Tuesday in October. Leaves half-turned. He was raking the yard. I found him sitting on the grass, breath shallow, eyes confused. From that day forward, our world grew smaller. Hospitals in Burlington. Cardiologists. Medication schedules taped to the refrigerator. Daniel visited twice that first year. Claire sent flowers. I didn't keep count. That's what love is supposed to be, I thought. Not keeping count. The last winter was the hardest. Richard's hands trembled when he tried to button his shirt, so I buttoned it for him. He hated being cold, so I warmed his socks by the radiator before putting them on his feet. Some nights he would wake disoriented. "Are they all right?" he'd ask. "Yes," I would say. "They're fine." He always meant the children. Even then, 8 months before he passed, I walked into the den and heard Daniel's voice through the half-closed door. "She won't matter once you're gone," he said. Not loudly, not angrily, just matter of fact. Silence followed. Then Richard's voice, weaker than before. "That's enough." I stepped away before they saw me. That night, Richard held my hand longer than usual. "Promise me something," he whispered. "What is it?" "Don't let them make you small." I didn't know then what he meant. I thought he was worried about loneliness. I didn't understand he was worried about legacy. The funeral home doors remained closed. Guests continued to arrive. Some glanced at me confused. Some looked away. No one asked questions. Snow thickened on my shoulders. For a moment I considered leaving. Driving back to the house on Maple Ridge Road. Sitting in Richard's chair. Letting the day pass without witness. But something kept my feet planted to the stone steps. Not pride. Not defiance. Something steadier. I had not missed a single doctor's appointment in 6 years. I had not left his bedside the night he slipped away. I would not disappear now. A black sedan pulled into the lot. I recognized it immediately. Mr. Holbrook, Richard's attorney for over 2 decades. The car door opened. He stepped out carefully, adjusting his scarf against the cold. He paused when he saw me standing outside. His brows drew together. "Mrs. Whitman," he called gently. "Why are you out here?" I held his gaze. "They say I'm not on the list." He looked from me to the closed doors, then back at me. And in that quiet Vermont snowfall, something shifted in his expression. Not shock. Not outrage. Recognition. As if a puzzle piece had just clicked into place. He nodded once. "Stay here," he said softly. Then he walked toward the doors and reached for the handle. And this time when it opened, it did not open gently. Mr. Holbrook did not hesitate. He opened the glass door fully this time and stepped inside without asking permission. The warm air from the lobby spilled out onto the steps where I stood, melting the snow at my feet. I couldn't hear everything at first. Just the shift in tone. Low voices. A sharper one, Daniel's. Then Mr. Holbrook's voice, steady and clear. "I was not informed that Mrs. Whitman would be excluded." There was a pause. "This service is for immediate family," Daniel replied. His voice carried now. "She is immediate family," Mr. Holbrook said calmly. "She is his lawful wife." I stood still. I did not move toward the door. I did not beg to be let in. I had learned something in the last 6 years beside a hospital bed. When you've done your part faithfully, you don't chase validation. You wait. Inside, I could see Claire step closer, her expression composed but tight around the edges. "This isn't about legality," she said. "It's about honoring Dad the way he would have wanted." Mr. Holbrook didn't raise his voice. "In that case," he replied, "we should all be very careful about interpreting his wishes." Silence followed. The kind that tells you something larger is standing in the room. A few guests began to glance toward the entryway. Whispers. Uncertainty. The young attendant who had first spoken to me shifted awkwardly, looking between the siblings and the attorney. Then Mr. Holbrook stepped back toward the doorway and looked at me. "Mrs. Whitman," he said clearly, loud enough for others to hear. "Please come inside." I held Daniel's gaze as I crossed the threshold. He didn't step aside immediately, but he did step aside. The lilies were stronger up close. Sweet. Overpowering. Richard's photograph sat on a wooden easel near the front of the chapel room. He looked younger in that picture. Stronger. Alive. I removed my gloves slowly and placed them in my coat pocket. No one spoke to me directly, but I felt the shift. The subtle recalibration of roles. The service began a few minutes later. Soft organ music. The pastor from our church in Montpelier spoke about faithfulness, about endurance, about steady love. He talked about Richard's business, his generosity, his discipline. Then he said something that caught in my chest. In his final years, Richard often spoke about the grace of being cared for. I lowered my eyes. He didn't say my name. But he didn't have to. Daniel gave the first eulogy. He spoke about childhood fishing trips. About learning to swing a hammer. About responsibility. Claire followed. She spoke about ambition. About her father's expectations. About legacy. Both of them avoided looking at me. When the pastor asked if anyone else wished to say a few words, there was a long pause. I felt Mr. Holbrook's eyes on me. But I didn't stand. This was not the place to argue for space. Richard had never liked scenes. After the final prayer, guests lined up to offer condolences. Some hugged me. Some hesitated. One older neighbor squeezed my hands and whispered, "You were good to him." I nodded. That was enough. Once the last guest had left the chapel room, Daniel cleared his throat. "Before everyone disperses," he announced, "we'll gather briefly in the side room for a reading of the will." He glanced at Mr. Holbrook. The attorney adjusted his glasses. "That is correct," he said. "Richard requested that his will be read in full, immediately following the service." Claire crossed her arms lightly. "That's not typical." "Your father was a deliberate man," Mr. Holbrook replied. "He had his reasons." We moved into a smaller room with a long oak table. Frost clung to the window panes. Outside, the snowfall had slowed. Chairs scraped softly across the hardwood floor as everyone took a seat. Daniel sat at the head of the table, Claire to his right. I chose a chair near the window. Not at the head. Not at the center. Just present. Mr. Holbrook placed a leather folder on the table. He opened it carefully. "This document," he began, "was last amended 8 months ago." 8 months. I felt my breath catch almost imperceptibly. That would have been early spring. Around the time Richard insisted on meeting privately with Mr. Holbrook in the den, Daniel leaned back slightly confident. Claire folded her hands in her lap. Mr. Holbrook began reading. Standard language first. Formalities. Legal definitions. Then the distribution of assets. "To my son, Daniel Whitman, I leave the Lake Champlain cabin and associated land parcel." Daniel's jaw relaxed. "To my daughter, Claire Whitman Lawson, I leave my investment portfolio and associated business holdings." Claire exhaled quietly. "And to my wife, Eleanor Whitman, I grant the right to reside in the primary home on Maple Ridge Road for a period of 6 months following my passing." 6 months. The words sat between us. Daniel glanced at me briefly. Not unkindly, but not warmly either. It was the look of someone who believes the matter is settled. Mr. Holbrook paused. Then he turned a page. "There remains," he said evenly, "one final clause." The air changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Daniel straightened. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around each other. I looked at the falling snow beyond the glass. And for the first time that morning, I felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the grief. Not hope. Not yet. But recognition. Richard had always been careful with his words. And when he said something was final, he meant it. There remains one final clause. Mr. Holbrook did not rush the sentence. He let it settle. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the faint hum of the heating vents above us. Daniel shifted in his chair. "If it's minor, maybe we can." "It is not minor," Mr. Holbrook said calmly. He adjusted his glasses and continued reading. "Should my lawful wife, Eleanor Whitman, be denied participation in my funeral service or related rites by any party," he paused only long enough for the words to land, "then all previously designated distributions of my estate shall be suspended." The air left the room. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But you could feel it. Claire blinked. "Suspended." Mr. Holbrook continued. "In such event my entire estate, including real property, financial holdings and business interests, shall be placed into an irrevocable trust." He turned another page. "My wife, Eleanor Whitman, shall serve as sole trustee for the duration of her lifetime." Daniel's chair scraped slightly against the floor. "That's not," he began. Mr. Holbrook held up a hand. "I will finish." He read the final sentence carefully. "My children shall receive distributions from said trust only at the discretion of the trustee, contingent upon conduct deemed respectful and in good faith. No one spoke. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock. Claire's voice was the first to return. "That's conditional," she said. "That doesn't mean." "It means exactly what it says," Mr. Holbrook replied. Daniel's face had lost its earlier confidence. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that because she wasn't formally listed on the funeral guest list, because she was denied participation," Mr. Holbrook corrected gently. Daniel's eyes flicked toward me. I did not look away. He stood abruptly. "This is absurd. Dad wouldn't." "Your father amended this clause personally," the attorney said. 8 months ago. In my presence. Claire leaned forward. "What prompted it?" Silence followed. Then Mr. Holbrook answered plainly. He expressed concern that his wife might be marginalized after his passing. The word hung there. Marginalized. Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "We weren't marginalizing anyone. We were trying to keep things private." I spoke then. Not loudly. Not sharply. "You locked the door." No accusation in my tone. Just fact. Daniel's jaw tightened. "We needed space." "You had space," I said gently. "You had 6 years." The room fell quiet again. Mr. Holbrook closed the folder but kept his hand resting on it. "The trust becomes effective immediately," he said. "Given the events of this morning, the condition has been met." Claire's composure began to fracture at the edges. "So the cabin?" she asked. "Transfers to the trust," he replied. "The investment accounts?" "Trust." "The house?" "Trust." Daniel exhaled sharply. "You're saying we get nothing." "I am saying," Mr. Holbrook replied carefully, "that your access to the estate now depends upon the discretion of the trustee." He looked at me when he said it. Not with sympathy. Not with triumph. Just acknowledgement. I had never managed more than a household budget and the occasional church fundraiser. Now I was being handed oversight of a construction company, 2 properties, and an investment portfolio. It felt less like power and more like weight. Daniel turned to me fully for the first time that morning. "You knew about this?" "No," I said. Claire studied my face carefully, as if searching for a crack. "There's no way he'd do something this drastic without telling you." "He didn't," I answered. "He handled his business quietly." Daniel let out a short, humorless laugh. "This is manipulation." I shook my head slowly. "No. It's precaution." The word surprised even me. But it felt right. Outside, the snowfall had stopped entirely. Pale winter light filtered through the frosted windows. Daniel sank back into his chair. "So what now?" he asked. Mr. Holbrook folded his hands. "Now, Mrs. Whitman assumes fiduciary responsibility. The trust documents will be filed this afternoon." Claire's voice softened slightly. "And if she refuses?" "I won't," I said. They both looked at me. "I won't refuse," I repeated. "Your father built that business from nothing. He protected it during recessions, during storms, during bad contracts. I won't let it unravel. Because of feelings." Daniel stared at the table. "And us?" he asked quietly. I considered the question carefully. "You are his children," I said. "That has not changed." "But," Claire pressed. "But respect is not automatic," I replied. "It's practiced." No one argued with that. Mr. Holbrook gathered the documents neatly. "There will be formal meetings," he said. "Account reviews. Operational decisions." Daniel gave a slow nod, the fight draining from his posture. Claire looked older than she had an hour earlier. Not defeated. Just recalibrating. As we stood to leave the room, Daniel paused beside me. He didn't meet my eyes at first. "We didn't think you'd be left with nothing," he said quietly. 6 months in the house seemed fair. Fair. I buttoned my coat slowly. "I never asked for more than a seat at the service," I said. He had no answer to that. When I stepped outside into the cold Vermont air again, the sky had begun to clear. The world looked the same as it had that morning. Snow on the trees. Ice along the sidewalks. But something fundamental had shifted. They had locked me out of a room. Richard had locked something else in place. And for the first time since he passed, I understood what he meant. Don't let them make you small. When I drove back to the house on Maple Ridge Road that afternoon, the driveway looked untouched. Snow had settled evenly across the stone path Richard had laid himself 20 years ago. The porch light was still on. Daniel must have forgotten to switch it off when they left for the funeral home. For a moment, I sat inside my car with the engine running. The house did not look different. But it was no longer 6 months. It was no longer temporary. It was mine to protect. That felt heavier than ownership. Felt like stewardship. I stepped out slowly, the cold air sharper now that the storm had passed. My boots crunched against the packed snow as I climbed the porch steps. I paused before unlocking the door. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it that morning. Richard's mug in the sink. His reading glasses on the small table beside his recliner. The blanket folded neatly across the armrest. I walked into the living room and stood there for a long moment. This isn't how I wanted it, I said softly, though there was no one to hear. I did not feel victorious. I felt watched. As if the walls themselves were asking what I would do next. That evening Mr. Holbrook called. I've initiated the trust filings, he said. You'll need to come by the office tomorrow to sign several documents. I've never managed something like this, I admitted. You've managed far more, he replied. You kept Richard's business running the last year he was hospitalized. You handled payroll when he couldn't. That was different. Yes, he said gently. It was quieter. He paused before continuing. Eleanor, this clause wasn't written in anger. It was written in foresight. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder he had given me. Inside were summaries of assets I had only seen in fragments before. The Lake Champlain cabin. The primary residence. 3 rental properties. The construction company accounts. Investment holdings diversified across several portfolios. Richard had always been transparent with me about our finances, but he had never made me feel responsible for all of it. Now I was responsible. The next morning, I drove into town to Mr. Holbrook's office. Vermont winter sunlight reflected sharply off the snowbanks along the road. Everything looked clean. Too clean. Inside his office, the air smelled faintly of old books and coffee. He spread the documents across the desk. Under the trust, he explained, all assets remain intact. You are obligated to preserve and grow them responsibly. And the children? I asked. They are named beneficiaries, he said. But distributions require your approval. I signed where he indicated. Each signature felt deliberate. Not powerful. Just binding. 2 days later Daniel called. His voice was measured. I'd like to come by, he said. To talk. You're welcome to, I replied. He arrived that afternoon alone. No Claire. No attorney. He stood awkwardly in the foyer, snow melting off his boots. I didn't expect this, he admitted. Neither did I. He glanced around the living room. You know I never wanted to push you out, he said. We just thought, after Dad passed, things would be clearer. Clearer how? He hesitated. That we would take over. Take over what? I asked gently. The business. The properties. Everything. And where did you think I would be? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. I assumed you'd downsize, he said finally. Move closer to your sister in New Hampshire. Start fresh. Start fresh. As if 28 years were a chapter you could close and shelve. I built this life with your father, I said quietly. It wasn't something I rented. He rubbed his temples. Claire's upset, he admitted. The investments were part of her long-term planning. I'm not taking them away, I said. I'm overseeing them. That's the same thing, he replied. No, I said. It isn't. He looked at me then really looked at me as if seeing me outside the role he had assigned. You're going to control everything, he said. I'm going to protect everything, I corrected. The difference mattered. A week later, the first business meeting took place at Whitman Contracting's small office just outside town. The employees had known Richard for decades. Some of them had watched Daniel grow up. They watched me carefully when I walked in. Mr. Holbrook introduced me formally as trustee. There were no dramatic reactions. Just nods. Measured acceptance. We continue operations as usual, I said. Payroll remains on schedule. Ongoing contracts will be honored. My voice did not shake. I wasn't speaking as a widow. I was speaking as someone who had kept the books balanced during hospital nights. Daniel sat across the table silent. After the meeting, one of the foremen approached me quietly. "He'd be proud," he said. I nodded. Later that evening Claire called. Her tone was sharper than Daniel's had been. "This isn't sustainable," she said. "You can't expect us to just wait indefinitely." "I don't expect you to wait," I replied. "I expect you to participate." "In what?" "In respect." Silence stretched across the line. "You think this is about manners?" she asked. "No," I said calmly. "It's about trust." Outside my kitchen window, the snow began to fall again. Slow. Steady. Vermont winter was patient. So was I. They had thought the funeral was the end of something. But it wasn't. It was the beginning of a different kind of inheritance. And this time no one was locking any doors. By early March, the snow along Maple Ridge Road had begun to thin. Not disappear. Just soften around the edges. That's how things felt inside the family too. Not healed. Not resolved. Just less sharp than the morning of the funeral. Whitman contracting was steady. We had 3 active renovation projects and 1 new municipal bid under review. I attended the weekly operations meeting every Monday at 8 a.m. At first, the men in the room addressed their updates to Daniel. Old habit. He had grown up around the company. He knew the language, the measurements, the rhythm. But gradually, their eyes shifted toward me when decisions needed to be confirmed. Not because I demanded it, because I listened. Listening changes rooms. One morning after a meeting, Daniel lingered behind while the others filtered out. "You don't have to be here every week," he said. "Yes, I do. You could appoint someone." "I did," I replied. "You." He looked caught off guard. "You're still operations lead," I continued. "Nothing changed about that. Except that I answer to you." "You answer to the trust," I corrected gently. He leaned against the conference table, folding his arms. "You know that feels the same." "It shouldn't," I said. "The trust isn't emotional. It's structural." He studied me for a long moment. "You've changed," he said finally. I shook my head. "No. I've stopped stepping back." That afternoon, I drove to the Lake Champlain cabin. I hadn't been there since late fall. The lake was still partially frozen, gray ice stretching toward the horizon. Wind moved across the surface in quiet lines. Richard had loved this place. He built the back deck himself. Insisted on hand-cut beams instead of prefabricated supports. Inside, everything smelled faintly of cedar and cold air. I walked from room to room slowly. This was supposed to be Daniel's, a gift of legacy. Instead, it was now part of something conditional. I stood at the large window overlooking the water and let myself ask a difficult question. Was this punishment or protection? There's a difference. Punishment looks backward. Protection looks forward. I wasn't interested in looking backward anymore. When I returned home, Claire was waiting in the driveway. Her car engine was still running. She stepped out before I reached the porch. "We need clarity," she said without preamble. "Come inside," I replied. She didn't remove her coat once she entered. "I spoke to my financial advisor," she began. "The investment accounts are essentially frozen unless you authorize distributions." "They're stable," I said. "Not frozen. For planning purposes, that's the same." I poured tea into 2 cups and placed one in front of her. She didn't touch it. "What do you want, Claire?" I asked calmly. She hesitated. "Security," she said finally. "Predictability." "Your father built both," I replied. "And he tied them to behavior." She exhaled sharply. "You make it sound like we're children." "No," I said. "I'm reminding you that inheritance is not entitlement." Her expression hardened. "We didn't mean to exclude you at the funeral." "You did," I said quietly. "That morning was chaotic. It was deliberate. The truth doesn't have to be loud to be firm." She looked away first. "You could release partial distributions," she suggested. "Demonstrate good faith." "I will," I said. "When I see it." "And what qualifies?" Consistency, I answered. Participation. No attempts to bypass the trust. No quiet conversations about removing me. Her eyes snapped back to mine. I never. Daniel did, I said gently. Last week. With a different attorney. She went still. He's frustrated, she said. So was your father, I replied. That's why he wrote the clause. Silence settled between us. Outside, snowmelt dripped steadily from the roofline. I don't hate you, Claire said suddenly. I never assumed you did. Then why does this feel like a standoff? Because you're used to control, I said. And now you're negotiating. She stood slowly. You're not what we expected, she admitted. That goes both ways. After she left, I sat alone at the kitchen table. Grief has stages. So does power. The first stage is disbelief. The second is resistance. The third is adjustment. We were somewhere between the second and third. A week later, Daniel requested a formal review of the company's quarterly performance. This time he sent the email directly to me. Not through Mr. Holbrook. Not saying Claire. Just me. The meeting was professional. Measured. At the end, he paused before closing his laptop. I shouldn't have said what I said that day, he muttered. At the funeral? No. Before. He swallowed. 8 months ago. So he knew. I heard you, I said. His face drained of color slightly. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. You meant it exactly the way it sounded, I replied. But you didn't understand the consequence. He looked down at his hands. I thought once Dad was gone, things would simplify. They did, I said. He frowned slightly. How? There's no confusion anymore about where I stand. He nodded slowly. The snow was nearly gone by the end of March. Grass began pushing through in small, stubborn patches. Change in Vermont never happens dramatically. It happens in layers. The trust remained intact. The assets secure. But something else was shifting too. Respect doesn't arrive with legal paperwork. It arrives with repetition. And for the first time since the funeral, both Daniel and Claire were beginning to show up without trying to push me aside. That didn't erase what happened, but it did signal something important. They had locked a door once. Now they were learning how to knock. By late October, Vermont had turned gold again. The same trees that had stood bare and brittle the morning of Richard's funeral were now dressed in quiet fire. Maple leaves scattered across Maple Ridge rode in soft, restless waves. The air carried that clean edge that only New England autumn knows how to hold. It had been 8 months. 8 months since the door of the funeral home closed in front of me. 8 months since the clause changed everything. Whitman Contracting had not only survived, it had grown. Daniel had secured 2 new municipal contracts over the summer. He no longer sent proposals without copying me. He no longer tried to maneuver around the trust. He came to the house for Sunday coffee now. Not every week, but often enough that it felt intentional. Claire too had changed in quieter ways. She began forwarding quarterly portfolio updates before I asked for them. She stopped referring to the investments as my accounts and started calling them the trust accounts. Language matters. Respect begins in small corrections. One afternoon in early October, I drove to the Lake Champlain cabin again. The water was no longer frozen. It reflected the sky in wide, unbroken blue. The dock boards creaked under my steps, just as they had when Richard first built them. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. I had made a decision weeks earlier. The trust would retain ownership of the cabin. That was clear. But it would not sit unused, waiting for tension to soften completely. Instead, I opened it as a seasonal retreat for widows in the community. Quiet weekends. No publicity. No advertisements. Just women who needed space to breathe. The first group had come in September. They left handwritten notes in a small wooden box by the fireplace. Thank you for the silence. Thank you for the lake. Thank you for understanding. I read those notes slowly that afternoon, standing near the same window where I had once asked myself if the trust was punishment or protection. It was neither. It was responsibility. Later that week, Daniel called. We'd like to come up to the cabin, he said carefully. All of us. Just for the day. All of us. It was the first time he had included me in that phrase. You're welcome to, I said. They arrived the following Saturday. Claire brought cider. Daniel carried firewood. No one tried to claim a room. No one spoke about deeds or distributions. We walked down to the water together. The air was crisp but not cold. At one point, Daniel stopped beside me on the dock. I replay that morning sometimes, he said quietly. So do I. I thought protecting the funeral meant protecting Dad. And now? I asked. He watched the lake for a long moment before answering. Now I realize I was protecting control. I didn't correct him. He didn't need it. Claire joined us a few minutes later. I never apologized, she said plainly. You don't have to dramatize it, I replied. I'm not, she said. I'm acknowledging it. The wind moved across the water, lifting small ripples. I was afraid, she continued. Afraid of instability. Afraid of losing what felt secure. You didn't lose anything, I said gently. We almost did, Daniel corrected. There it was. Understanding. Not perfect. Not polished. But real. That evening after they left, I stayed behind at the cabin alone. The sun dipped low over Lake Champlain, casting long amber light across the deck Richard had built with his own hands. I sat in one of the wooden chairs and let the quiet settle around me. The funeral felt distant now. Not erased, but absorbed. They had locked me out of a room. Richard had anticipated it. Not because he doubted his children completely, but because he knew grief can distort judgment. The final clause had not been written to punish them. It had been written to protect balance, to make sure no one could shrink someone else simply because it was convenient. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the gloves I had worn that morning in March. The loose thread on the thumb was still there. I smiled slightly and finally trimmed it with a small pair of scissors from my purse. Small repairs matter. As the last light faded, I whispered something I hadn't said aloud since the funeral. You were right. Not about the clause. Not about the trust. About something simpler. Don't let them make you small. The wind moved softly across the lake. The house on Maple Ridge Road remained steady. The company carried his name forward. The trust continued quietly without drama. And the children, his children, were learning something that money alone never teaches. Respect is not inherited. It is practiced. They locked me out of his funeral, but they never locked me out of his legacy. And in the end that made all the difference.